Hi, everyone. I'm Molly Antipole. I'm an assistant professor in English and creative writing here. And first off, during a devastating week like this, I hope that all of your loved ones are safe. Thank you to the Taube Center for Jewish Studies and the Creative Writing Program for hosting this event, and to all of you for coming out tonight. I'm really happy to be introducing GennaRose Nethercott and Gabriella Safran, who will be in conversation tonight about fiction and Jewish folklore. Nethercott is a folklorist, poet, songwriter, and fiction writer whose wonderful debut novel is Thistlefoot. The novel centers around the famous folklore character Baba Yaga, with Nethercott reimagining the Yaga siblings, Bellatine and Isaac, as Jews in an East European shtetl. I loved this book. It is shot through with a wise and electric voice that manages to feel both urgent and timeless. The book is both a celebration of the power of storytelling and is also a profoundly powerful examination of trauma and memory, and ultimately of survival, all of which feel painfully relevant today. Wendy Smith of the Washington Post called it gorgeously written, riveting, and moving. Mallory Yu of NPR praised the novel, saying, at times solemn, at times playful, the narrator speaks to the reader like a storyteller to a crowd gathered around a campfire. Thistlefoot balances fun and solemnity, joy and suffering. And the great fiction writer Kelly Link wrote, irresistible, exuberant, and appropriately sure-footed, GennaRose Nethercott's Thistlefoot brims over with an earthy magic, picaresque adventures, and eccentric and formidable characters. It's a fabulous, weird, and gorgeous book. Nethercott will be in conversation tonight with our own Gabriella Safran, Senior Associate Dean of the Humanities of Arts and Professor of Jewish Studies, Slavic Languages and Literatures. Professor Safran is a leading scholar on Russian literature, Yiddish literature, folklore, and folkloristics. She is the author of Wandering Soul, The Dybbuk's Creator, S. Anskaya, and her most recent monograph, Recording Russia, Trying to Listen In on the 19th Century, looks at how Russian subjects and visitors to the Russian Empire display their skills at listening to and recording the words of the people. I admire this book for myriad reasons. For its gorgeous braiding of literary analysis, intellectual history, and the examination of language itself. And for a book about sound, I suppose it's apt that I found myself wanting and then actually doing it, actually reading these passages aloud, both for the compelling ideas that Safran puts forth and for the beautiful poetic compression of the sentences. Stephen Lovell, author of Summer Folk, praised the book, writing, compelling and original, Recording Russia provides a fresh and insightful perspective on one of the classic questions of Russian cultural history, the relationship of the educated elite to the people. Drawing on a wide range of examples, Safran shows that the 19th century Russian writers were engaged in a partly competitive exercise to divine quote-unquote authentic listening, and thereby to bolster their claims to speak on behalf of the Narod. There is nothing quite like this book. Professor Safran is now working on a new book about the international prehistory of the Jewish joke, exploring when, where, and why the Jewish voice began to be heard and recorded and seen and known as distinctly funny. The conversation tonight seems in every way like a perfect pairing. Please join me in welcoming GennaRose Nethercott and Gabriella Safran.
Thank you, Molly.
Yes, thank you so much, Molly. And thank you all for being here. What a great full room.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much. And thank you to Tuesday, who organized all of that. So, yeah, we are going to speak about folklore, Jewish folklore, Slavic folklore, and GennaRose's wonderful book. And we're going to work really hard to have there be no spoilers. So if you haven't gotten to the end of it, it will not be revealed. But some other things maybe will be revealed.
Yeah, little sneak peeks.
Sneak peeks. I thought we would maybe start with asking GennaRose to read a little bit of the book out loud, and then kind of coming out of that, we're going to talk about the kind of folkloristic aspects of the book and the kind of research and folklore that she did in coming up with the book and writing the book, and just like what it means to be inspired by the folklore of another time and place, and all kinds of other questions are going to come up also.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to kind of volley questions back in your direction, so we'll get to have a real lively conversation going. Could I borrow that copy of my book?
Yes, to which I've attached the little
your mic, yes.
mic thingy. There we go.
Amazing, thank you.
Okay.
So I am, throughout the book, there are moments that are in the form of folktales, and they are told in the voice of the house itself. I'm curious, how many of you have read Thistlefoot already? Okay, we've got a sprinkling. So I'll tell you a little bit about the book, I guess, before I dive into it. Thistlefoot is the story of two contemporary Jewish American siblings, Isaac and Bellatine Yaga. And the two of them have been estranged for a long time. Isaac is a street performer, and he's a little bit of a con man, and his sister Bellatine is basically the opposite of all that. She's very practical, very grounded, she's a woodworker. And the two of them are brought back together because they learn they're receiving a mysterious inheritance. Now, that inheritance, it turns out to be a sentient house lofted up on chicken legs. Yes, so how many of you are familiar with the folklore of Baba Yaga? Most of you, okay, that's why you're here today. It's a room of Baba Yaga, or Baba Yagas. I said this at the show last night, but I always say Baba Yaga instead of Baba Yaga because it feels the same to me as saying croissant instead of saying croissant. But that's just my own personal problem, so don't judge me for it. So it turns out that Isaac and Bellatine's ancestor, their twice great-grandmother, is none other than Baba Yaga, the famed crone from folklore, who in the old stories lives in a house on chicken legs. The difference, though, in this tale is that this version of Baba Yaga is a Jewish mother living in a shtetl in the months leading up to a pogrom in 1919. So we mostly follow Isaac and Bellatine on their journeys in this house, but we also slip into the past now and then, and we hear about Baba Yaga and her daughters and the world in which they live in the voice of the house itself, who is our storyteller. So, all of which is to say, I am going to share one of those little folk tales with you today, if I can find it. I will admit I do have it memorized, so I don't really need to find it, but it's nice to have a prop. This is actually a story that is adapted from a few pre-existing characters. Baba Yaga is one of the characters, of course, and then the other character in this piece is from a Jewish folktale, a traditional Jewish folktale, about a woman who is on her way to shul, and she runs into this man who basically reaches out his arm way too far, and it is very scary, which is kind of a spoiler for this little thing I'm about to read, but at any rate. Do not be a fool. There exists no such thing as a ghost of the dead. But, little house, you will say, what of the dark shadows our mothers have warned us about? Agraspat Mahal dancing on the roof, Mazakin causing rifles to misfire and poisoning well water, Aluka taking a daily blood meal at horses' throats. And to you, I will say, you do not listen. These are demons, not ghosts. There are demons among us, that much is certain. But a ghost of the dead? You may look out my windows all you like, you will not find one. But little house, you say, what of Shaul Hamalach, who, with the help of a witch, conjures Shmuel, I've never read these out loud. Shmuel, how do you pronounce Shmuel Hanavi? I nailed it. Spirit to defend the Philistines. Can the Torah lie? Fa! It was a trick, as all witches are tricksters. No miracle. There are plenty of miracles in this world and the next, but dead men wandering beside the living is not among them. Any rabbi could tell you that. But, little house, you say, what of Dibacum, who cling to our backs, who make us convulsed with seizures and writhe with migraines all day, all night? Are they not real? To this, I will say, your questions give me headaches. does that make you a dybbuk? And I do not even have a head. But little house, you say, what is a memory, if not a ghost? There lives a woman in the shtetl of Gerenkrovka in the region of Kirkasy in the Empire of Russia. The Gentiles on the outskirts of town, they believe this woman is a demon, for she lives in a house unlike all other houses. They say she can make a child from a tooth. They say she feeds these children noodle soup brothed in lost travelers' bones. Do not go near Baba Yaga's hut, or she will put a candle in your skull and make a lantern of you, they say. The Jews in the market, they do not care if she's a witch or a cucumber, so long as she is not a shiksa, and so long as she brings healthy eggs to sell, and so long as she keeps her daughters from biting the other children. The Jews, they have heard their people called demon before. They learned to stop listening. One morning, Baba Yaga goes to town. When she arrives at the market, she finds the village empty. When she goes to the grocery, there is no grocer to sell her peas in pickling jars. When she goes to the milliner, the hats are gossiping among themselves, alone. When she goes to the butcher, the floors are too clean, no blood at all. Finally, as she makes her way toward the synagogue, she spots a lone, lingering man. "Pardon me, stranger," Baba Yaga says. "Can you tell me where everyone has gone? I hope it is not some high holiday and I've forgotten to go to shul." The stranger tips his brimmed hat and smiles. "Why, yes, today is a holiday. Today is the first day of the end." Now, Baba Yaga has no time for riddles and no time for strange men, so she continues on her way. "Wait," says the man. "Let me accompany you to the synagogue." "I am perfectly happy to walk myself," Baba Yaga replies, and she begins to step away. The air is cold and tight, and the smack of her boots against cobblestone travels through it quicker than a telegraph. "Sister, please," entreats the man, "what sort of neighbor would I be if I did not at least open the door for you?" And with that, the man lifts his arm. The arm elongates, emerging like a column of smoke. It stretches twice its length, then thrice, then 4, 5 times too long. As it reaches, the man's coat sleeve lengthens too. The arm stretches past Baba Yaga and across the square and up the granite steps until at last it arrives on the synagogue door with a tap, tap, tap. By now, Baba Yaga knows she is not speaking to a man at all. "On second thought," Baba Yaga says, "I think I'll visit the rabbi tomorrow." She makes her way home, but when Baba Yaga looks back up, she notices the man's other arm. It too has begun to stretch, skinny and birch-like as kindling. It is vanishing in the very same direction toward which Baba Yaga had come, toward home, toward me. "What fine daughters you have," says the man. "Such soft hair." Baba Yaga begins to run. Thank you.
All right. So something I was really fascinated by in reading your book, something that I find fascinating is the way that it mixes folkloric elements that people think of as traditionally Slavic and not Jewish with elements that people think of as Jewish and not Slavic.
Right.
And I felt like, when I started to become interested in folklore myself, I found those elements like kind of described in different books, in different collections.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? I had kind of a sense of like, there's Russian folklore here with Baba Yaga, and then over here there's Jewish folklore. Different.
And never the twain shall meet.
Yeah. And then I feel like something happened both maybe in my own reading, but also in like the kind of scholarship that people started to write, or the sort of research that people started to do, where I began to realize, well, there really there were all kinds of ways in which in the Russian Empire, so in this kind of pre-1917 world, where Jews and Slavs were living close to each other, there were all kinds of ways in which they were influenced by each other's folklore, and there were, folk healers. Like, you would maybe go to a folk healer who was not from your own group. You might, in fact, have the sense that the folk healer from, the Jewish one might be more effective than the Christian one, you might think, as a Christian, or vice versa, right? Maybe they would have access to something that your own people didn't have access to. And I started to just learn more about ways that the Jewish folklore was, like, stories and songs were sort of accessible to non-Jews, and vice versa.
Right.
And I found sort of traces of interactions with, like, Russian folklore in Yiddish literature, and all of that's like fascinated me more and more. And so reading your novel, I've been feeling like, that's so interesting. Like, do you think that you're weaving together of Russian and Jewish folklore, like, where does it come from? Is it of the moment?
Mm-hmm.
Is it, how do you understand it? That's like a big.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I think, I have a number of different answers to that, so I'll kind of glance over them. But I do think that we have this idea of, like, shtetl life, for example, as being this incredibly insular thing where there was no interplay between, like, the Slavs and the Jews, but that just isn't how life was. Shtetl life was market culture primarily, and they would trade with each other, they would work with each other, and naturally there would have been a cultural interplay going on. And I think, that's very indicative of how folklore functions, right? It is this form that is singularly, organically designed in a way to be able to adapt to new contexts and to be able to be adopted by new tellers and to be influenced by those tellers. I think that we have, the term cultural appropriation has taken on such, like, a dirty association, and it can be very damaging if done wrong, but it also is how folklore travels, is by people telling stories to other people, and then those people finding something of themselves in that story. With Baba Yaga specifically, I think there's a really interesting kind of cultural smorgasbord going on with her. As far as I could tell in my research, she wasn't a story that ever really was a Jewish story. It was very much a Slavic story. However, she was used at times as a tool for anti-Semitic propaganda and rhetoric. With any of these characters, they have a bunch of different functions. So in one way, she was a way for parents to tell their kids not to go into the woods and, like, fall in a stream and drown. Because if they go in the woods, Baba Yaga will eat them. On the other hand, you have this figure who's known for devouring Christian babies, which obviously is rhetoric that we see often in anti-Semitic propaganda, blood libel, etc. So she's been kind of plucked and used and weaponized in different ways throughout history. So to make her a Jewish character kind of is a pushback against the latter usage of her. As well as, like, for me, where it started, the idea of telling this as a Jewish story and using this folklore as a Jewish story came from more of a personal history angle. The seed of the novel was so my first book, The Lumberjack's Dove, is a book-length poem sort of in the form of a folktale. And it was my first book out. It won the National Poetry Series in 2017. Actually, Louise Glick selected it, who teaches here sometimes. And I was like, this is my big break. I really want to do it up right. And because I'm psychotic, for me, doing it up right meant I was going to spend 8 months solid on the road living in the trunk of a Honda Fit with a puppet show. And so yeah, basically, if anyone's seen a Honda Fit, they're not large vehicles, but I'm not a large vehicle either. So I converted the trunk of this Honda Fit. It had a little bed built into the back. It had a little closet. It had a puppet theater with a 60-foot long hand-turned scrolling shadow panorama. And I was in a new city every 2 days for 8 months. I did over 100 shows. And so I became obsessed with Baba Yaga's hut because it was very aspirational for me at the time. I was like, if only I had a house on chicken legs, my life would be so luxurious. So I was thinking about it a lot. And I'm always very fascinated and tickled by moments in which folklore that we associate with antiquity chafes up against modernity. And so I had this image in my head of Baba Yaga's hut, like hanging out in a Walgreens parking lot and like scratching at a candy bar wrapper. And I just thought it was like the funniest thing. I was just like entertaining myself. And so that was the initial seed. And then I was thinking, okay, well, what would it actually look like if this figure were to make itself present in a modern American context? Which led to the next thought of, well, it would have to be an immigrant from that part of the world. Hey, my family immigrated from that part of the world, and why not use this as a vehicle to tell my family's immigration story? And so the shtetl in Thistlefoot, Gerenkrovka, is based on a real shtetl, Rochmistrivka, that my family came from. So yeah, I guess, long story short, the Jewishness of the folklore originally came from just my personal connection to the story and my personal connection to myself and my lineage melded together. And then the more research I did, the more I was able to kind of tease the threads of those connections wherever I could find them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it's kind of an answer. I had been thinking of bringing up this question of, when is it appropriation and when not? And I find when I teach, I often teach classes on folklore and literature, and I find that my students are like really, really fascinated by appropriation as a concept. They worry about it. They wonder, they want to do something. They want to use the folklore that they learn about. They're fascinated by, they're drawn to folklore. I mean, they don't come to my class unless they're not, unless they're drawn to folklore, right? And so often they are, creative people. I mean, or they're scholars, but in being scholars, they're creative also. And they're like troubled by, worried about, fascinated by like these questions of like ownership. When is someone's story one I can use? What would happen if I used it wrong? I'm not as worried maybe about that. I'm really sure my students are not going to use folklore wrong, but I'm respectful of their concern, and I wonder whether there's some way that your book is really interested in ownership, and sort of who owns the house on chicken legs? Does it own itself? And I wonder if maybe there's some way that you're kind of dealing with our contemporary like anxiety about folklore and ownership in the way that you weave these themes of ownership and kind of uncertain ownership.
I think where a lot of the anxiety around appropriation comes from is from a very rightful recognition that a story can be used as a weapon. And I think one of the primary themes in Thistlefoot is that it matters who tells the story and how, like, what it is used for. It's really a reverence of the power of story to be concerned with questions of appropriation, and because it recognizes that a story can be used to harm or to help, and that depending on how that story is represented will determine whether it is harming or helping. And so that is why we often talk about, it's a very different thing for an oppressed people to tell a story from their culture than for the oppressor of that community to tell the same story that they got from them, right? Because one of those things can then be weaponized. I think that, in a way, the question, well, for one, I think folklore is inherently, it's interesting to hear it referred to as who owns it, because I think folklore is inherently anti-capitalist in its very nature. It is not about ownership. It is not a commodity. It is not a finite resource that can be commodified. It cannot be bought or sold. And so therefore it is inherently this sort of radical anti-capitalist entity where it can't be owned, it can't be monetized. I mean, on a legal level, it's even in the public domain, right? So it kind of defies all of these capitalist frameworks that are placed over so much of intellectual property and property in general. It's not property, it can't be property. But that said, I think it's less about, who owns it, because it can't be owned, and more about who does the folklore own? And by which I mean, nothing exists within a vacuum, right? So when we're telling these stories, we're not just telling the story itself, we are telling all of the associations tied into that story. So if I were to tell a story about an apple, saying the word apple is like this conjuring act, where it's not just an apple. It also will conjure for each of you your own personal associations with an apple. You might remember being at an apple orchard as a child with your family. You also might think of Adam and Eve. You might also think of the Snow White. There are all of these different cultural and personal associations with any story, with any object. And so if you're going to be using that story, if you're going to be writing from a story, you want to be aware of what you're conjuring in your readers. I think of it kind of like if you were a baker, you would want to know the ingredients that are going into your muffins. If you were just chucking things in randomly and being like, oh, I don't really care what the ingredients are though, because I just care about the muffin, you're not going to really end up with a muffin. Or you'll end up with a very strange muffin that maybe isn't doing what you think it's going to be doing. So I think a story functions the same way, and dealing with folklore functions the same way, where it's like, yes, anyone can tell any story, but you want to be fully aware of the ingredients that you are including in that recipe, and thus all of the cultural associations that you can be aware of when dealing with this story. I think about, for example, if you're writing about goblins, you're gonna miss the mark and do something unintentional if you're unaware of all of the sort of anti-Semitic history of goblins. That doesn't mean you can't tell a goblin story and have it not be related to Jewishness, but it's like something that will be in the minds of readers because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. So that's kind of how I think of the idea of adapting folklore and appropriating folklore is, it's not owned by anyone. It is not a piece of capital or property, but it does come with baggage and tethers, and you want to know what those are.
Yeah, I mean, one way that people think about folklore is it's texts that exist in multiple variants and are circulated by a group of people who have at least one linking, factor in common, right? So that's maybe a way to think about your kind of reframing of it's not who owns folklore, it's like who does the folklore own?
Right.
Like who circulates the folklore? Who, with whom are you entering into conversation?
Absolutely.
When you as a contemporary verbal artist use or kind of retell a story, and you do need to know who you're talking to,
Totally.
Because funny things happen when you don't know who you're talking to.
And it's also just how to use the tool efficiently, which actually, this kind of relates to one of the questions I was going to ask you, which as someone who both is a folklorist and also works in literature, Have you noticed any patterns as you read literature that is drawn from folklore, in the ways that folklore, or in the ways that authors tend to change folklore when it becomes literate, other than the obvious, it's static, it becomes single authored? Have you started to notice any patterns in the ways that when it's translated into the literate form, it tends to shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that, when something is oral, when a text is circulated orally, it tends to be a story about a certain kind of character, right? There's certain stories, there's certain, I think it is probably actually true that that we have trouble paying attention when we're listening to something that's tremendously complex. That's kind of like a banal, facile thing to say, but it's probably true anyway, right? So one of the things that maybe it's hard to listen to is somebody's tremendously mixed motivations as they do something, right? So characters in oral stories tend to have less mixed motivations. They tend to do something for a reason, and not for like 17 different reasons of which they only know 3. But maybe the other 14 are the most important, and gradually over the next 400 pages, we will realize what those other 14 motivations are, and we'll see patterns that were not apparent to the characters themselves, right? And that's why it's fun to read a 400-page book, and you should all read this book because it is really fun and involves mixed motivations. Right.
And don't worry, it gets sad too.
It's sad, yes.
It's only fun for now.
Life is sad. But yeah, like I think there's certain kinds of characters that we can tell stories about or out loud, and then there's other kinds of characters that one writes novels about in 2023 and 2022 in the case of this novel, and people. I think it is not, I think this thing that you do in this novel where Baba Yaga her motivations are less mixed. And the house on Chicken Legs, its motivations are kind of mixed, but they're not as mixed, right? They're not as complex characters as Isaac and Bellatine, who are really complicated, and they like don't understand themselves, and they can maybe come to understand themselves in certain ways. And so you're doing this thing where you're very carefully alternating between the kind of what seems to me to be a kind of folkloric voice in the sort of short chapters narrated by the house, that give us more the perspective of Baba Yaga herself, and the longer chapters that put us more into the mind of the contemporary characters, right? You're using the folklore, you're weaving it in very consciously, and I see that as that seems to me to be how writers can use folklore.
Right.
Yeah. But I think there's other ways too, and then there's also just this question of like what are the sorts of folklore that inspire us now? Like I do think a lot about. I sometimes teach Svetlana Alexievich Chernobyl Prayer. So has anyone here read it? She won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. She's Belarusian. It's a really, really compelling and upsetting book about Chernobyl that is a kind of, it comes from oral histories that she did with survivors of Chernobyl and people who lived in the villages near Chernobyl, some of which are Ukrainian villages, many of which are Belarusian, and she did all this oral history, and then she takes the things that she heard from people who saw, also from children who were born after Chernobyl but were affected by it, genetically. So she does all this oral history, and then she weaves that into these narratives that that don't perfectly align with the things that people told her, right? She takes liberties, and she was criticized a lot for sort of taking liberties with the oral histories that she did of these survivors of Chernobyl. But the result is very compelling, right? It's so effective, and I feel like that's part of what you can do as a writer, right? Is you can take stuff that's written and you can weave it into you can take stuff that's oral and you can weave it into a written text in a way that does stuff that only writing can do, and that's like good. That's not a distortion. That's like you doing what you can with your instruments.
It sounds like in The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, he talks about the difference between uppercase T truth and lowercase t truth, one of them being the facts of what happened and the other being the emotional truth of the situation. So he will talk about, for example, like a buddy of his being blown up by a mine, and then in the next scene it's 30 years later and they're having coffee together. And of course, that is not the literal truth, but it is the emotional truth, and therefore it is true. And I think that, to me, is one of the things that's so fascinating about folklore, is that it deals in capital T truth. It allows you to tell a story almost more honestly than telling the historical facts would allow for, because it allows the logical world in which the story is inhabiting to match the internal emotional reality of the characters. And so, for the stories that are following Baba Yaga and her daughters, it's this idea of how do I tell this story without looking directly at it? And the idea of how folklore is used so often in history as a tool to tell something that is too painful to look at directly. And Tuesday gave an amazing analogy for this earlier today, where it's like in, the old Greek myths, where you can't look directly at a monster, but you can look at it in the mirror. And that, I feel like, is what folklore allows us to do. It allows us to look at something indirectly through sort of hyperbole and story. I always think of it as turning the volume knob up on reality. And that allows us to actually deal with a reality we may be incapable of dealing with otherwise. And therefore using story to actually grapple with human issues that otherwise would be impossible to grapple with because of their painfulness or their grandeur or their taboo or what have you, or even their complexity. It does allow us to simplify, to distill down, to have good guys and bad guys. And again, that is also very easily translated into being a weapon. As soon as you turn things into a black and white, it immediately can be weaponized. So yeah, I'm very obsessed with all of this stuff. And when you were talking about the idea of like what kind of folktales would be told now in 2023 versus these stories that were being told thousands of years ago, and like using the same figures in both contexts, and they apply to both, but they change in their behavior. I'm very obsessed with this idea, and I'm very curious to hear your take on this, about like why folklore and fairy tales are having this renaissance right now. I refer to it as neo-romanticism. And I think there's this, it's very popular to be doing fairy tale and folklore retellings, and like cottagecore is in. And I think it's very easy to dismiss this as like cutesy or frivolous or like whimsical in a derogatory way. But what I see is going on is like, okay, so if you look at the Romantic era, like the Romantic poets, you've got Keats, you got Shelley, you got Byron, my favorite idiots. And they were writing these romanticized kind of fairy tale magic stories. The reason for that was they were living in the wake of the French Revolution. Everyone was dying of tuberculosis. They thought war might be coming to their shores at any time. They were surrounded with violence, disease, and uncertainty. And in this time of extreme stress and extreme uncertainty, the only natural battle that they could fight against it was to bring magic and romanticism into their lives to soften the suffering of how it felt to be a human and the uncertainty of that. And I think that we now, today, are living in incredibly uncertain times. We have, between COVID and climate crisis and just all of the violence of being a person, we are living in a time with a lot of fear and a lot of stress. And so it makes sense to me that in the wake of that, you see this simultaneous rise of romanticism, of fairy tales and folklore, of wanting there to be some magic and softness in the world. So what may on the surface look like a twee story or a twee inclination is actually, I think, a cultural survival tactic. And also like a cultural pushback against the chaos and violence of personhood in the Common Era.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think we are living in a neo-romantic era, and there is something about precarity that prompts romanticism. I wonder whether there's also something about the way that folklore and folklore-like literature, or literature that draws on folklore, I think it might also create, or it gives us the impression that it might create community in ways that non-folkloristic, less romantic literature might do less of. I'm really fascinated by jokes, and I really like a book by Ted Cohen called Philosophical Thoughts on Joking Matters or something. It's like a philosophical look at jokes. It's really fun. It's illustrated by jokes. It's like 70 pages long. It's very enjoyable. But he has all these really interesting things to say about jokes. And one thing he says is, we tell jokes to see who else will be entertained. Like we're very interested in creating community via this sort of very quick mechanism of jokes. Jokes sort of show us who agrees with us that things are funny. Jokes can also make community. Like you can tell a joke in a way that will bring people into your joke, and will sort of give you a sudden. It can kind of be an intimacy generator. Right? I mean, jokes can, of course, also be a violence generator. Absolutely. And a hostility generator. Yeah. And part of why it can be an intimacy generator is because it can be a violence generator. But I think there's a way in which folklore has a kind of ability to act in the social world. Yeah. That is not that not all verbal art can do, and long novels that have folklore in them can do some of that too. And that's maybe part of that sort of neo-romantic magic.
And I think that's where you see like all these fandoms, you know, like where fan art comes out of are these like magical and sci-fi based stories. There's something in stories that are larger than life that does allow for that kind of like intensive, obsessive community building. And then you have like fanfic, which is a whole new genre of folklore.
100%. Yeah.
Wait, do you have a favorite joke?
Oh, I have lots of favorite jokes, but maybe afterwards I'll tell one.
I only know dirty jokes. So, I mean, I know others. I just, for some reason, like I can't remember a joke if it isn't filthy. It just goes right back out again. So I don't know what that says about me, but here I am today.
Yeah, I know lots of very like nerdy Soviet era jokes.
I love that. I love that for you. I love that for us, hopefully, soon enough.
We all need nerdy Soviet era jokes.
Yeah, so I do feel like we should let other people ask questions. Okay. But I actually promised you that I would ask this other question, so I'm going to ask it while you all try to decide if you have questions. So the last question I wanted to ask is there a question you wish people would ask you at these things that you never get asked? And you're like, why don't they ask this?
I would think of an answer to that, and I forgot to do it. Let's see.
You can also think about it.
Well, one of the things I had, questions? I had wanted to add a question. I kind of wanted you to ask me about the research, because I then wanted to bounce it back to you in a way, because there's overlap in our research, where in writing Thistlefoot, it's very important to me to ground the fantastical in the literal, and so I did a ton of research into like the details of what patterns would be on people's blouses in a shtetl in the year 1919, you know? Thistlefoot the house, I said this in class yesterday, but like I did all this research into exactly what trees would have been growing in that town, which then would have been felled for lumber, which then would have been turned into this house. I read like architectural descriptions of shtetl architecture to turn into this house. So, I mean, and I just love that stuff. I can get real deep. It's a great way to procrastinate actually writing a novel, let me tell you. And one of the most essential resources that I used was Ansky's ethnographic photographs, photographing a Jewish nation, which is an incredible, incredible resource. For those who haven't seen it, it's a book of photographs from a shtetl between 1912 and 1914. And they are incredible. They're so detailed. It's just people's everyday lives. And it was like, I've never seen so many photos of shtetl life anywhere else. It's a wonderful collection. And it was like, I could literally go in and be like, oh, what kind of hairstyle would the tobacco seller at the market have been wearing, you know? How would they knot their scarves? All of these like minute details that you would never be able to know unless you saw it, and that I think are so essential to our everyday lives. Just these like small sensory details. And I really think that if you're dealing in a fantastical realm of storytelling, it will just float away like a balloon if it is not tethered by these real world details. And you know, readers may not even notice them or pick up on them, but I know they are there and I can feel the weight of them holding it down. So I wanted to hear a little bit about your work with him and his studies, as well as the concept of Dybbuk as well, which he wrote a play called The Dybbuk, which there's some Dybbuk content in Thistlefoot as well. I was doing some research into Dybbuks there's a scene where there's an exorcism, and I was like, well, do Jews really do exorcisms? And oh yeah, they do, big time. And the funniest thing that I found was, I was reading about Jewish exorcisms, and one of the things that I found describing it was like, you know, in Catholic exorcisms, the priests would go in and they're like, we're here, we're gonna banish this demon, like, we got this, let's get him out of here, the power of Christ compels you. And then the Jews were like, maybe it'll work, I don't know, you know, it might, we may as well give it a go. And I'm just like, that's so Jewish, like, I love that so much. They were like, can't hurt to try. And that was kind of like the attitude behind the exorcisms. So yeah, just kind of like what your thoughts on that whole realm are between his work and the Dybbuks and all that fun stuff.
I mean, I loved working on Ansky. So I wrote this book about Ansky, who was a Russian and Yiddish writer and ethnographer who lived in the Russian Empire, born in 1863, died in 1920. And he was like a sort of self-taught ethnomusicologist and sort of ethnographic researcher who ran these, he collected folk tales, folk songs, and he ran these several summers in a row of big like expeditions, research expeditions to some little shtetls near Kyiv in Ukraine. And he didn't know where to stop. I mean, he had a kind of completist attitude, which is typical of ethnographers, and he ended up collecting just thousands and thousands of songs and stories and objects and just all this stuff, treasure. And I found that I became, in researching him, I mean, I learned about him when I was in grad school, which was in the 90s. So it was right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Jewish history of that part of the world was not studied very much because it had not been There were only very specific ways people were permitted to study it in the Soviet period, and those ways kind of got more and more closed off. So it wasn't studied very much, and then the study of it kind of resurfaced in the 80s and then became really possible in the 90s. So in the case of Ansky, he left these enormous archives of some of the ethnographic material he collected, and then also his manuscripts and letters to him and letters from him and just tons of stuff. And that stuff that he left was very dramatically, like it was in St. Petersburg, this stuff, and then it went to Moscow, and then it went to Kiev, and then during World War II, it was sent to the Urals along with lots of other like cultural treasures, and then it was brought back to Kiev, and then there was a point when the Soviet archivists were ordered to destroy their Jewish collections, but his archive was not destroyed, it was deaccessioned, which means that the archivists who were supposed to destroy it instead destroyed the card catalog. So it appeared that it had been destroyed.
And now it's just way harder to organize.
Yes, so the stuff all still existed, and it was like hidden in a church for a while, and then in the 80s, late 80s, people started to say, I think this archive still exists. I think it's out there. I think it's hidden somewhere. Some people said it was just deaccessioned, and then it really surfaced in the 90s, and the people who had deaccessioned it said, no, it really still exists, and they kind of brought it back up, and then it got recatalogued in this very beautiful, detailed catalog. So I was so privileged in that I got to do research on this material that was just coming to light, and that people had not been, a million people hadn't been researching it. I got to be, among the first people to look at it, and it was so thrilling. And then at the same time, as I was researching it, as I was learning about Ansky, I was getting to know lots of Russian Jews who were themselves starting to get access to that part of their own past that had been off limits, right? So for me, there was a kind of excitement. There was a sort of drama to the story of the research that kept me going.
Yeah. Right. And you can't beat the mystery of an archive, and it's like exploring a tomb.
Oh my gosh.
Magical.
It was so much like exploring.
You can tell we're nerds because we're like, you got to go in an archive? Wow. Yeah. That's cool. I'm jealous.
I mean, and in a way, maybe I felt like I felt that neo-romanticism, right? I understood my own research project as, even though it was fully scholarly, and the book that I produced is a fully scholarly one, but there was something romantic about the research and the kind of thinking, as well as the character himself, Ansky, who is absolutely a neo-romantic character, as folklorists are, people who are drawn to folklore.
I remember when I first saw those photographs too, there was this incredibly uncanny sensation of, this is what daily life looked like for my family, but it was something I had never seen. And one of the large themes in Thistlefoot is how much of ourselves are inherited from stories we've never been told. How much of ourselves are passed down from parent to child, and that by the time we reach them, we don't know them anymore, but we embody them and we feel them, and we are making choices based on these stories that we actually don't know. And so to see photographs of a lifestyle and a world that is so far off from my own, but certainly must have informed something of who I am, was very surreal, and like this kind of time travel experience, like looking in a mirror as if I'd never looked in a mirror before, which was very cool.
Yeah. Wow, well, I feel like we should let other people ask questions. I see a hand. John.
Thank you so much to this wonderful novel. But just one question that pops to my mind is about the locations that the characters travel through, which are locations that do have Jewish histories but are not thought of as Jewish regions, like New Orleans, or like riding the rails in the West, or Ballantine being a kind of small town in New England. And so I was curious, how did you choose those locales?
Those are the places I live. So I was living in New Orleans at the time that I was writing the book. I was literally working as a street performer in New Orleans, writing poems to order on the street for strangers. So everyone I knew were street performers in New Orleans. And I grew up in southern Vermont around a bunch of puppeteers. And a lot of members of my community in New Orleans are train hoppers. And so the contemporary communities in the novel are very much drawing from my own communities and connections. So, and I think that's sort of part of the importance of Isaac and Bellatine's journey, is both literally and figuratively, is that they have become so far removed from this history because of the contexts in which they live, and the fact that they are still impacting them out of that context. But yeah, on a basic level, it was a write what you know kind of situation.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is fascinating. I was wondering about your choice to narrate from the point of view about the house. I'm sitting here trying to think of, it's not like an inanimate object. I guess like the house is somewhat animate, but it's not a person. And then a full of books that I've read that are not narrated, that are not, omniscient, but are narrated by something. And okay, well, there's the bus that came out. I don't think Wayne was the same Mysterian by Dax, but like it's not really that either. I was wondering kind of like how did that come to you, and kind of what questions that puts for you as a writer, and how did it come to you?
I honestly don't remember a moment of being like, oh my God, the house should talk. And I think the reason for that is that almost felt more natural than the rest. The voice of Thistlefoot is much closer to my organic, natural writing voice than any of the direct close third. It was very difficult for me to write normal. To write just a direct close third narrative. And I think honestly it shows in the quality of the writing. Like the sections that the house tells are just better. But it's because that's the mode I'm most comfortable writing in and telling in, is this kind of storytelling voice. And I think I've always related to houses specifically, but buildings in general, in this animistic way. Almost from like a Shintoist perspective of the house is another roommate in a way. The house is just as alive and aware and has this memory of everyone who's ever lived in it. Every house in a way is a haunted house in my mind. And so the idea of Thistlefoot being the one to tell the story, that was the most obvious part in a way of the entire book for me. And the voice of the house itself was a blend of my storytelling voice, which is very much that like gather around the campfire children kind of tone, as well as drawn from other writers who were telling shtetl stories like Sholem Aleichem and Isaac Bashevis Singer, kind of drawing from those and paying homage to them, as well as my own kind of natural tone.
Yeah, so I thought it was really interesting what you said about making sure you root a fantasy story, even one based on folklore, in like concrete facts or a concrete world at least. I was wondering what you thought about this kind of impulse that I think some people have to ascribe like something real behind a piece of folklore, like something that it was attempting to describe. Like I've heard a lot of people kind of reframe the Baba Yaga story as, the house on chicken legs was a metaphor for, like stilt houses that the dead would be traditionally put in old Slavic cultures. And, on one hand, at least I personally, I think like it's kind of like a question of like, how useful is that? Is that very useful for generating thoughts on these kind of like folkloric stories, or is it not? What do you think?
I feel like we can both speak to this one for sure, but I guess I think with something like that, we can never know, right? These stories are so old and have shape-shifted in so many ways that we can't know for sure. We were actually speculating on this exact question earlier, which was, you know, where did this image of the house on chicken legs come from? Was it from a stilted house? Was it from another tradition? Who knows? I feel like for me personally, I kind of don't care that much about origins, but I do care very much about uses. So while I don't think it's necessarily essential to know where a folk tale started, I think it is very important to know what the metaphorical parallels have been throughout its usage and how it's been used, how it's been used as a tool across cultures and across time. How it started might be one of those contexts, but the very nature of folkloric figures is that they adapt to new contexts and they serve new purposes as new tools. And yes, one of those tools is just to tell a story, but it's rarely the only purpose that they have. They usually are working double time to also either impart some kind of lesson, provide a cautionary tale, create an explanation for something we lack explanation for, or as we were talking about earlier, allow for a community to talk about something too painful or taboo they otherwise could. So yeah, the origin I think is just one example of how that is used, but it is no less important, or it is no more important than all of the other applications of it throughout time. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking about, as you were talking, and also in response to the question about having the house narrate, I was thinking about how buildings in Slavic folklore have spirits, right? A house has a house spirit. The domovoi, the bathhouse has a bathhouse spirit. You know, everything has its own spirit, and the spirit is opinionated and might have sort of opinions about what you do in the house, and it might steal things or in various ways express disapproval of choices that you make in the house, and that I think is it's productive, right? In the sense that like folklore can be understood as productive or not productive, right? So just the way like verbal forms, linguistic forms can be productive or not productive. They can kind of go on generating new things like themselves, or they can sort of seem to be frozen, right? So the notion that a house has a house spirit is productive in that contemporary, in a Russian environment, at least contemporary studies of folklore see that people have adapted that notion to contemporary houses. Not everybody, right? But the idea that your house has a house spirit is something that people, even today in Russia, might say. Maybe jokingly, maybe in that like, I believe it, I don't believe it, but they're willing to sort of voice it. And you can hear people voice things like, the house spirit in our house really likes, barrettes. And that's why my kids always lose their barrettes, or I was in a Russian village like maybe 10 years ago, and I heard someone say with like total seriousness, the barn spirit in our barn doesn't like white cows. So our cow died and we got a brown cow, and it was no good. And we had to and then someone was like, no, the barn spirit only likes white cows. I had to go get white cows. So, there's a kind of like workaday, kind of really ordinary way that element of folklore lives. And I felt like you were really, in making that choice to have the house narrate, you were like cluing in to something that's so productive. That's like a way that people thought about the built environment, that they themselves had built, like their house, 200 years ago, and that is so natural to keep thinking. Right? Of course our house has an opinion. Of course it voices.
It's a member of the family,
It's a member of the family. Like, to me, it was so natural and persuasive how the house on chicken legs speaks. And that's, part of that is your, amazing, wonderful writing. And part of that is like, I just believe it.
Well, thank you. And I think the examples that you gave as well speak to that other function of folklore, which is to provide an explanation or a sense of control over things we don't have control over. Where if you have this animistic being in your home and one of your cows died, you know, there was nothing you could do. This cow just simply, you know, your house spirit just doesn't like white cows. Or if your children keep losing their barrettes, your house spirit keeps taking the barrettes. Like, it gives this sense of explanation and this sense of control in an otherwise sort of chaotic environment. As well as like, and wow, it just left. It was here and then it left. As well as nothing. Yeah.
I see another hand. Actually, I see several other hands. Okay, Shayna.
I just want to say there's a children's picture book called Rules of the House by Mac Barnett, which has like a living house as a kind of character, which is also very good. I love children's books. I'll bring it in. But my question is this, just back to the ethnography. You've given us sort of all these kinds of different motivations, different things that folklore can do. And ethnography, I think one of the impulses behind it is to preserve something that you see is going to become obsolete. There's no other reason to kind of collect and write down other than to say, like, before it's gone. And I'm just wondering if you, in writing this book, had some kind of preservationist impulse behind your writing, if you were trying to save something before it became obsolete.
I love that question, yeah. Well, I think in terms of like folklore ethnography and that preservation, because folklore is constantly changing, no matter how many times you write it down, and then no matter what point in the process you write it down, you are writing down something that will soon be obsolete, because it is constantly going to be reinvented. So, you know, someone writing a Baba Yaga story 50 years ago and writing one today, it's not redundant all of a sudden because Baba Yaga has already been recorded. Those are two different Baba Yagas. I think of Thistlefoot, though, less as a preservational text and more as one more link on the chain. So, you know, if all of the Baba Yaga stories that came before, branching out in thousands of directions, are all these links on this elaborate chain mail of story, I think of Thistlefoot as just one more link. And people ask sometimes if it was intimidating to write from something that had such a legacy, and how I decided what to include, how I decided what to leave out. And to me, the answer is kind of like, no, it wasn't, because this is a story that is designed to be adapted, that has specially evolved to be perfectly suited to a new version of telling it. And so it really did just feel like an additional link on what is like a great web of chainmail. In terms of the aspects in it that do feel preservational to me, they're more personal, I think. It definitely preserves certain periods in my own life, certain questions that I was asking, certain experiences and memories and places that I've lived, communities I've connected with, as well as ultimately a pogrom that took place in the town my family came from. So yeah, definitely more like personal history preservation, but folkloric history just like one more drop in the bucket. I used to be very, very obsessed with preservation, writing as preservation. And I think the older I've gotten, the less I've cared about that. Yeah.
I'm curious if you dream or imagine Thistlefoot being adapted into a full-length, either like play or puppet show.
Ooh, my ideal form for it would be like a mini-series, like a show. We've been in like casual conversations with Mattel, but like they haven't made any offers or anything. But like the idea of doing it as a movie was the idea, but you know, we'll see, whatever. But I'm a TV guy. I love TV. I think the greatest story ever told in the history of mankind is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so all I've ever really wanted is my own Buffy. That's basically my main motive for like creating in general, is I'm like, I just want my own Buffy. And so yeah, I would love to see it as a television show. In terms of the puppet show, I think I do have enough already content for it to be a full puppet show. I performed some of it last night, but I actually have 5 of the folk tales in puppetry, so it's about an hour's worth of puppet content. But yeah, I think it'd be I would love to see, my dream would be like Guillermo del Toro directing, right? Wouldn't that be perfect? And then like, I don't know, I could see like a Timothée Chalamet, Isaac. I mean, that's fair. It's fair, but he's just, I mean, but isn't that also kind of the energy one feels toward Isaac?
He's a shapeshifter.
That's true. Anyway, yeah, cool question.
Another question.
Yeah, I have another one. I have many. So I haven't read it yet, but one of the things that came up, so I'm also in literature, and I know that there's always, oral literature for a long time just didn't count, right? Because it wasn't real,
Right.
because he didn't write it down. So that's clearly not worth our time. So then kind of with, and therefore folklore also has, often been kind of poo-pooed, at least in the French tradition, which should surprise nobody. But I was wondering that, in terms of like, I'm just curious how you would situate your novel in terms of different genres, because for me, I was like, it feels very a little bit magical realism, and then I was like, is that just because you don't want to say that it's folklore because you have that? But it's a novel that incorporates folklore, but folklore doesn't always include elements of magic, right? You can have folktales with, like realistic people doing normal things. So I was just wondering kind of, and this I'm also curious for you too as well, like where do you situate, the link between folklore and maybe magical realism? I don't know, like you mentioned fantasy earlier, but it seems to me that there's something kind of bumping up there with when you incorporate maybe like well-known elements of folklore, but it's not just a story being told, like it's a real thing they're dealing with. What do you do with this house on chicken legs?
I fully classify it as magical realism. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, for one, it can't be folklore because it does not follow any of the patterns of how folklore develops. It is a single-authored literate text, not a multi-authored oral traditional text. And so it is inspired by folklore, it draws from folklore, and it mimics folkloric tropes and motifs, but it is very much magical realism. And for me, I love magical realism because I envision it as sort of, as we mentioned earlier, magical realism is just turning the volume knob up on reality. And I talked about this in one of my workshops the other day, but for those who weren't in that, which I think is all of you pretty much, the reason that I work in this magical realism mode is because to me it feels more real than realism. In our everyday life, we experience very little pathetic fallacy in that our internal landscape does not do anything to change our external landscape for the most part. Like our external landscape doesn't give a damn about how we are feeling. A character or a human being with a broken heart are not going to be sitting and then their chair burst into flames. That's just not how the logic of our world works. However, in magical realism, it is. And a character with a broken heart could suddenly shatter into shards of glass, and that is perfectly reasonable within magical realism. So to me, it actually is the mending of a dissonance, right? It's to make the external world of the characters match the internal world of the characters. And folklore functions in a very similar way, and with a very similar logic. That almost is designed to feel more real and to make the world more understanding and enveloping of the human experience than what we consider realism to do. So yeah, I almost can't write in any other mode because it's just the way I experience being a person, and it's the only real logic system that makes any sense to me.
Fascinating.
Excellent. Yeah, okay.
Is Baba Yaga a Jewish folktale now? Now that you have written this?
Well, I guess that would depend on how it's being fan-arted, which I would say yes. If it was just the book and readers weren't taking it and making their own out of it, I would say no, because again, this is not a folktale, it's a piece of literature. But there have been a number of readers who have then taken that and made their own art around it that is Jewish art and does feature this character. So yeah, there is a version of Baba Yaga that now exists that is Jewish. That is not to say Baba Yaga is Jewish folklore. There are a million Babas Yaga who are not. And but there is now one that is. And I'm sure there was one that was elsewhere somewhere too, even if we aren't necessarily aware of her.
I have only a couple of comments. I'm writing my dissertation on ghosts in Polish and Yiddish literatures. But I have really good news for you. You're pronouncing Baba Yaga correctly in Polish.
I have been told that, yes, thank you.
My other, I guess it is a question, but it doesn't go as deep as the other questions have. There's an Isaac Bashevis Singer story called The Little Shoemakers, where Abba actually goes into the attic and sort of consorts with the spirits of the house. And the concept is sort of that the house is sort of like their heritage, their ancestry. So before he immigrates to America, he has to sort of say goodbye to the house and, well, the spirits and the ancestors that live in the house. It's a really interesting moment. And I wonder if your novel draws on that.
I actually haven't read that particular story. So no, but I did read a lot of, I was reading a lot of his like demon-centric stories because I love a demon, but I haven't read that particular one. Yeah, that sounds great. I love him, he's amazing. Your dissertation sounds dope. I agree. Cool. In the back there?
Run me through kind of the emotions that you had while birthing this creation. Give me like a timeline of it. Was it all childlike wonder and
If only.
distraught? You know, what are we talking about? What does it look like over time, and where?
Cool, great question. So I like to talk about this as much as possible because I think it's important for writers who hate writing to know that that's okay. I hate writing. I would rather do anything else. I find it excruciating. I was actually describing to a friend the other day what writing this novel felt like. It felt like stitching closed a wound with my own hands on my own body. And so it was like every sentence was like putting a stitch in. But by the time I was done, I'd closed a wound. And that was mostly how it felt, which was super chill. Basically, I mean, okay, so to walk you through, I just love talking about how much I hated writing this book. The initial idea came fairly naturally, and the first thing that I knew was how it ended. So I did have this kind of magnet that was pulling me through. The beginning was probably the easiest part, as it often is in writing a novel, because you have all this time to introduce characters and to establish setting and premise, and that's all kind of a simpler thing to do. Then COVID hit, and so first off, I had arranged a very insane writing schedule where I was living in New Orleans at the time. It was just before COVID hit. It was Mardi Gras. And what I would do is I would wake up at like 1 in the afternoon. I would write until like 10 p.m. and then I would go out to like a parade until like 4 in the morning. And then I would come back, like peel off my clown outfit, fall asleep, wake up, do it again the next day. And that oddly was the most joyful time of writing the book because it felt the most balanced. I didn't feel, genuinely though, I struggle a lot with being a person balanced with being a writer, and figuring out how you can be both of those, which seem to me as very disparate things, even though they shouldn't be, where in this particular time period, I was able to not feel like I was missing out on the world by being a writer because I was going out and having these fantastical adventures. But then also when I was out in the world not feeling crippled by guilt because I'll have known I wrote that day. Otherwise, I feel crippled by guilt basically 100% of the time, that I'm just allowing myself to live as a person, which is fun. And so that was the first stage. Then COVID hit. I took a break from it and just dealt with life, and then I went back to it. I was writing a strict regimen of 600 words a day, 4 days a week. I'm a very slow writer. I still write like a poet. I'm trained as a poet. So I spend an immense amount of time on every single line before moving on to the next line. It makes it take forever to write a first draft, but then my first drafts are fairly clean when I get to the end. But 600 words a day, 4 days a week was like manageable for me. We ended up selling the book when it was about a third of the way through. So we sold it on spec. And that at first I was like, amazing, now I have this contract, I know it'll come out in the world, this is so great. And then I realized, wait a second, I have never written a novel before. I don't know that I can do justice to this story. I knew I wasn't going to fuck it up so bad that they would cancel my contract, but I didn't know if I would be able to create a book that I personally felt proud of enough to put out into the world. But I knew it was going to go out into the world because it was now contractually obligated to. So then I panicked big time. And that was really when a lot of the more existential devastation came into play, which pretty much maintained the rest of the time. Yeah, it was horrible. I hated every second of it. And then it was done. And then the editing I liked because then it was there. I had something to work with. And I was no longer mortally terrified. But yeah, and now I'm really proud of it. And I'm really happy I wrote it. But yeah, I just want anyone who wants to be a writer but like would rather die than write to know that like that's okay. You can do it anyway. I don't know if that's great advice, but that's how I do it. So.
Oh, well, this is a wonderful, I think, point to end on. Let's thank GennaRose Nethercott.
It's a dark ending, but here we are.